Kelly Blosser.
Sorry.
My name is Kelly Blosser. I am a volunteer with the Little Cities of Black Diamonds Council. And we are very excited tonight to have a panel of our historians. We are recording this, so hopefully people can enjoy it on YouTube after the live event this evening. But our main goal here tonight is to make sure that people have a chance to ask questions directly from our many very brilliant historians who give their time to the Little Cities of Black Diamonds. So with that in mind, I thought maybe we could start with some introductions and go along the panel. And for each of you, if you can just say your name, what community you're coming from, and what your favorite area of historic research is. I think that would be a great way to start us off. And Janice, you're in the hot seat because you're first on my computer.
My name is Janice Ivory. I'm with the Renville community, and I don't think I have a favorite. Renville, I guess, would be my favorite area at this point, but more than that, I couldn't say. I get excited about all types of history. I'm especially excited about the questions that we have to answer tonight, too.
Fantastic. It's great to have you here.
Thanks.
Anne, you're next up.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ann Cramer. I'm the retired archaeologist. I used to work for the Wayne National Forest, and I studied lots of periods of history there, but I would say that probably the Underground Railroad research and the Underground Railroad early African-American period was my favorite area of research. So.
Thank you. Yeah, fantastic. Tyler.
Yeah, hi everybody. I am Tyler Mcdaniel. I'm a historian and the social media director for Little Cities of Black Diamonds. My favorite kind of aspect of history in this region really is the way people have moved over time. I'm a human geographer. I went to Ohio University for that, so I've always loved the way people move around space, what drives them to move, what pulls and pushes them to move or travel from place to place and settle in a place, that kind of thing. So obviously the mining and industrial history of our region, and I'm from the Hocking County here, so right in the heart of the Hocking Valley. So it's very, very, very close to me because I've grown up in these hills in this region, so it's really special to me. So.
Chris. Whoop. Chris, can we get a quick introduction from you there?
It's my turn.
Yep.
I'm Chris Wilson. I grew up in Perry County, a rural area on a family farm. Left there, was gone many years, traveled all over the world, worked all over the world, retired about 3 times, and have came back to this area. I just like history, all kinds of history. Even though I hold advanced degrees in engineering, I've always liked studying and reading and listening to history stories.
Fantastic. And then Cheryl is the last historian on our panel. Oh no, I lied. John's joined us. So for Cheryl, if you want to type a quick introduction into the chat, we'll get you there. Cheryl's microphone isn't working this evening, but I can say she is one of our real experts on this region, and particularly on the labor history of this region. And I also am a little bit biased because she's my mom, so I think she's an absolute genius in all things. But I think a lot of people who aren't her daughter agree with me on that. So we're lucky to have her here tonight.
Yep.
And John, would you like to give us a quick historian introduction?
Uh-oh.
Oh, you're muted, John.
All right, sorry, from one Zoom to another. So, well, I'm John Winneberg. I'm one of the founders of the Little Cities of Black Diamonds Council dating back to the 1990s, and got interested in local history by collecting oral histories from folks for my a newspaper that I started back in the 1988 called Community Life News, and I kind of became fascinated by the local history story of the place where I grew up, and really interested in community development, as well as actually more than history. And then I started to realize that history was a great way to redevelop our community, because it was one of our greatest assets. Our nature and our history in this region are things that we could really build on. And I feel like the Little City story has advanced our cause of finding purpose for our communities in the coal mining regions of the corners of Athens, Perry, Hocking, and Morgan counties. So it's been a slow process, but I think it's made a contribution to all of us thinking more positively about this place on earth. So, yeah. And I really love the theme this week of from whence we came, because that's a big part of the story here about how people gathered here during the coal boom in the late 1800s, and still has an impact on who we are today. So, yeah.
Fantastic. So as you can see, we have quite a panel of experts here tonight, and I'm really excited that we get to hear from everybody. This is our first time doing a Q&A panel like this, so it's a rare opportunity. Since we have some of our question askers here in person, I would like to open the floor up to see if anyone wants to throw a first question into the ring. Maybe not. Okay. At any point, if anyone decides you do want to ask a question, please feel free to jump in, and I'll be trying to keep an eye on the video feeds too to see if anybody's trying to wave us down. But we do have some questions in writing, so I'm just going to go to those. So the first thing that we have some questions about is I see wanting to know a little bit more about the miners, and in particularly around what are some of the descriptions of the jobs in the mines, the labor responsibilities that people would have, maybe some of the different roles. You know, an example given is like miner, roof bolter, you know, things like that. And what kind of work was really done in the mines in this region. So who would like to jump in on that one of our historian panel?
Now, you know, when you, this is Chris Wilson, you got to be careful of the technology of mining. When you look at 1870 to basically starting in the middle of 1870 to almost 1900, and you just mentioned roof building. That technology didn't come into play until 1900 thereabout. Before then, the roof was held up by wooden timbers. You put posts down and the timber going across. The labor stuff in say 1875, you didn't have continuous mining machines. You didn't have machines at all. You did it with pick and shovel. But then it all changed later on in the late 1800s. And so when you talk about jobs in mine, you've got to look at the technology that came along. Okay.
Chris, what are some of the jobs people might not realize were needed in mines?
Let's take underground mining. You didn't have strip mining in 1875 or 1880 either. It was tunnels that were dug back in the hills, or you dug tunnels, and part of like let's say you visualize that you've got all these tunnels and the crossways, they 90 degrees from each other, and you got these pillars of coal they left, maybe they're 12-foot by 12-foot piece of a pillar of coal they left to help hold the roof up, if you can imagine that. And then once they get an area done, there was people that went in, and my grandfather, Wilson, and he took his own boys in there with him. And they would go in and take a pick, and they would take those black pillars and make them smaller and smaller and smaller until he would keep hitting the roof until he decided they couldn't make them any smaller. And they'd take that coal out and get paid for it by the ton. So you had all kinds of jobs like that. That went away when the mechanized came in, but before the mechanization, you had coal was hauled out on rails with pulling cars with mules, and you had all the people that had to feed and take care of the mules outside. You had people out there in the woods cutting timber and selling them for posts to hold the roof up. So you had people when they mined the coal and brought it out. They had people and a lot of times those were young kids almost, that sorted the coal into lumps, certain sizes of lump coal and smaller sizes. You had a lot of just physical labor like that in the early part of mining. And now that all changed, a lot changed starting in 1900 on to more machines and less hand labor. That's a long story.
When they were going in and chopping on the post in the mine, were they doing that for the mine company, the coal company, or were they doing it for themselves?
They were doing it for the coal company, but they didn't get paid by the hour. They got paid by the tons. They would take a car back in there, pulled by, I'd say, a mule, and they were given a tag, a round tag with a number on it, and they put that number on that little car, and they would put coal into that car, and then it would be pulled out to the tipple, and the mining company would measure that by so many pounds or tons. And the people that did, they would take that number like 120, and they'd say, 10 tons. He mined 10 tons a day, and so pay Cliff Wilson $10 or something. And that's how they got paid. But they worked for the mining company, but they didn't get paid by the labor by the hour. They got paid by the tons of coal that they mined.
They were even required to buy their tools to dig the coal from the company on top of, and that was taken out of the money they got paid for the coal. So your pick and your shovel and your bucket was from the company store. And so you may have made $25 for the week, but then they deducted a couple dollars for your equipment that you needed from the company store out of your pay. So they didn't even supply the tools without charging the miner for that.
That's correct. That's correct. And
yeah, those of you who watched the From Whence We Came documentary might see a political cartoon in there where they're criticizing the fact that they had to buy their own powder to blow in the mines, which would not have been cheap.
Yeah. I wish Cheryl was here. She could really clearly explain, and maybe
know.
Chris or Ann can, the whole charge, setting the charge in the mine, where they would take an auger and drill back into the seam of coal, and then put powder, explosives back in there, and then light what they called a squib. I'm trying to remember all this. I'm channeling my inner Jack Shuttle from Murray
Yeah, they
City.
tamp the powder in. That's tamping. You
Yeah,
get
you
the
have to tamp the
rod and you
powder
tamp
in,
the
and you
powder
put the
in.
squib in there, and then you lit it. And then some people said they say fire in the hole, and then they'd head out and let the explosion go off, and that would blow up a whole section of coal that would then drop down. They'd come back into the room that Chris was talking about, and then shovel it into their buckets. So, yeah, so
Jack would be very proud.
yes, yeah. So a lot of his collection of mining equipment's at the Hocking County Historical Society. Is that true?
Yes.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
we couldn't display it all, but we picked what we believe were the best artifacts and put them in a corner of the carriage house. I mean, it just, the Hocking County Historical Society doesn't have a lot of room. That's the
Right.
sad part of that. But I mean, I think Nyla Volmer did a pretty good job with the display of his artifacts.
Great.
We've got a complete inventory, and I took pictures of everything, and I gave all that stuff to Cheryl. So you guys should have, the records of the entire collection.
Great. And they're open on Saturdays. What are their hours?
Saturdays and Sundays from 1 to 4.
Or so, and it's right in the middle of Logan.
Yeah,
And what's the 2 streets that come together there?
Culver and Hunter.
At the corner of Culver and Hunter in Logan. Yeah. Yeah. Jack Shuttleworth was this wonderful, everybody's grandpa from Murray City that had this wonderful collection of mine equipment that he loved to share with the public. We took a lot of OU group tours through there, and kids learned about the early coal mining techniques. Another thing that I think is a fascinating part of this story that people usually don't understand about the Little Cities area and coal mining in Ohio in general is the coal boom in Ohio was very early compared to most states. Western Pennsylvania and Ohio were after the Civil War in the 1800s, and they were all unmechanized mines, pick and shovel mines. And one of the reasons that coal went out of existence so early around here was that once the union that the miners here started became so successful and negotiated better and better wages for miners into the 1920s, that the mines here couldn't produce enough coal to pay the miners here the wages that the unions have negotiated, because the mines were not mechanized. And so new coal fields in Eastern Ohio and Kentucky and West Virginia in the 1920s took over the major coal production in the United States. But in the late 1800s, they could get here quick with the railroad because we didn't have the mountains like West Virginia and Kentucky did. So we started early, but because we weren't electrified and mechanized, we lost out on our coal industry really early compared to most areas. So, and it all had to do with tools, the tools we were using.
I'm going to segue us a little bit into the next question, which is, in addition to the jobs in the mines, what other industries or ways of making money, I'll keep it really broad, were available to people in these communities because of the mines?
If I can jump in, one of the things I always found interesting that Cheryl mentioned, and I've read too, a lot of the spouses of the coal miners themselves would actually take it, they would actually take the odd jobs too. So it was a family effort to make sure that the family had enough income to actually live. And another aspect of that too is that, especially in the 1800s, coal companies would pay in scrip. So you had to use, essentially it was money that you had to use with the coal company stores that were in that town that you lived in, or maybe an adjacent town if that coal company had other mines in other towns. But So if you wanted to actually make physical money, potentially, you could take side jobs, and that's how you had to make your extra income, so that you could spend it when you went to other places, or if you hope to go to other places, even travel. That's something that was really, really hard. And also the spouses, to go back to that, the spouses would take in, clothing to wash, other maybe coal miners that didn't have, a spouse or a relative or somebody that they were living with that didn't have somebody to wash their clothing. They would have a friend or family member spouse wash that clothing for them, so that they then would patch things, where they would get torn in the mines coming in or out, things like that. So that was just one job. But that was something that I've always been fascinated with, because it was people, it was, a whole, not just people, but a whole family coming together to try and make ends meet. And so it was kind of, and, we were mentioning about like coal sorting, and I know that was something too that I think, Chris, I think you mentioned, like kids would do that, and I know Cheryl mentioned too, and all of you before, to me, how some of those people, they would have their kids as extra income as well, so that they would have their children, if they were old enough and able, would go down and sort the coal, so that family was getting a little bit extra income too in that way.
Fantastic answer. We have a question in the chat that I'm going to bring into this, which is, in this part of Ohio, where did most of the miners come from? What countries were represented among the Little Cities mines?
Dozens. Dozens. I don't know, John,
No, you
all
go
of
ahead.
you. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, initially, it was very English and Scotch Irish. So, from Scotland and Ireland. So there was a very, in the British Isles were really the 1870s. In that first, because the first, I guess we should mention, the first coal mining town that was purposely built for coal mining was in New Straitsville in southern Perry County there. So then throughout the 1870s and 80s, a lot more popped up in southern Perry, and then in Hocking and western Athens and so forth. But initially, that was the first wave. And then after that, a lot of, you began to see more from continental Europe. So, you had people coming from Germany, from Italy, from Sweden, Switzerland, which I know, well, you, Kelly, and Cheryl mentioned Roger Blosser is Switzerland, or is from Switzerland, his ancestry. So that's an example of, here. And then, John, you're German. So, that's something too, that not to go off topic, but it's fascinating how many names are still in this area from, that you can trace, and see that they came from Europe, different places. But, then we had Eastern Europeans. And those are interesting because in old news clippings from the 1800s and turn of the century, you see a lot of mentions of came from the Slav country, or the Slavic country of, like they'll say, like of Czechoslovakia, for example. But sometimes they'll just say so-and-so immigrated 20 years ago from the Slavic lands or the Slavic countries or something like that, that they'll just kind of group them all together. And in part, probably, I wondered why that they would do that, but in part it was probably because the people writing the newspapers at the time were not, probably didn't know their geography that well, and know those Eastern European countries like Italy or England and so forth. They didn't know Czechoslovakia or even how to spell it. They might have heard people talk about it, but they didn't know anything about it, or Serbia, or and such. So there was a lot of people at different time frames, because of different things going on in Europe, immigrated here, and then also in Renville. I've seen some news clippings from the 1900s where there was at least one Brazilian, or I believe two, that immigrated to Renville. So that's interesting too. So it wasn't just exclusively European. There were some outliers from all over the globe, really, that came here for one reason or another, which is fascinating.
I'll add to your answer just a tiny bit. Part of why they didn't differentiate between those countries was because the borders were much less clear at that
Right,
point
that's,
in history.
yes, thanks.
It
That,
wasn't until after World War I that some of those got clarified.
yep, that's very true.
But I will take that segue that you threw us there at the end to prompt Janice in particular. Janice, tell us a little bit about what kind of people lived in Renville and what sorts of origins people came from.
There were Italians, there were Germans, there were there were some Spanish people there too, but there were about I used to be able to just trip it off of my mouth. There were about 5 different ones that I remember specifically. There were some English. I can remember that there were a few there who were, even as I was growing up there, who still spoke their native tongue so strongly that you had a hard time understanding them when they tried to talk to you. And but they were from all over the place. What the part of it that got me was that not all, even though all of these people were coming from all of these different countries, a lot of them were coming in. They did not come in directly into the little cities area, but were sort of directed in a way to the area in looking for jobs. And it was sort of like they were directed to the coal fields and the silver fields. They were all the mining areas kind of thing. And it depends on how well they did. A lot of it depended on what coal mine they were working for. And the mine owner sort of determined what country he favored for the people who worked in his particular mine. So they were, it was like even though they were coming in from different countries into one place, they still were able to maintain their cultural identity from where they were guided as they got into the area, which made it really interesting. Because you got a chance to learn so many different things about so many different people that way. But the Italians were the ones that I remember the most as being in that area. And I think it's because Uncle Joe liked that language. So he talked about the Italians all the time. But then he was also a favorite of the Russians. You know,
Can you give us a little context on who Uncle Joe is?
Uncle Joe was the community scribe who he wrote letters for people. He was self-educated. He was, we're not sure of the story, whether he had polio or he was injured, because we've heard both of them, but he had no use of his lower body. And so he found other ways of being productive. He was a postmaster for a long time. He was the mayor for a little time. He taught himself at least 5 different languages so that he could communicate with the different people, the different countries who lived there in the town. He loved to teach people. He taught you anything you wanted to know as long as you were not a female. And,
That's for us.
it was the times. I mean, you know, I realize that now. I used to get really angry about it, but it was the times, you know, and I can remember him telling me that girls girls don't play chess. You remember that, girls don't play chess. And I used to get so angry because he taught every little boy who wanted to come in his door how to play chess, but he would not teach me how to play. And I always said, someday I was going to learn, and I was going to go back and I was going to challenge him to a game. I still don't know how to play chess. I have tried and tried, and it is not one of those things that I have been able to master. I have a granddaughter who is extremely good at chess, and I have often told her I was so like for Uncle Joe to still be here so I could just go tell him, look what I produced. But he was great. He talked to anybody, he talked to everybody, and he would tell you anything that you wanted to know. He loved Russians because they were so far away, and he always said the people undermined Russians. He reminded me so much of Joe Duffy, because Joe Duffy used to teach me geography and used to always tell me I would not shut up in class, and someday the Russians were going to come and I was the first person they were going to grab because I wouldn't shut up. But but Uncle Joe played chess through the mail with a guy who lived in Russia. And it was just, for me, I think it was the fact that he could communicate with somebody like that was one of the things that drew me to it. I'm sorry, I get carried away with Uncle Joe.
That's a great story. I do want to touch on, and I'll throw this question to, Chris or John in particular. I know you've both spoken to this in the past. Our region had a fairly significant Hungarian population. And as I understand it, you saw a lot of this population around the Drake's community. Would one of you like to embellish on that just a little bit?
Yeah, I live now, and also I grew up on a farm just about 2 miles away from Drake's up in the hills. And yeah, we always, not to be racist or anything, but there's one area in Drake's that we called Hunky Row because it was all Hungarians. And there was quite a lot of them. And there was quite a lot of people outside of the little town of Hemlock, not very far from Drake's. The county road named Bohemian, and that's because a lot of people from Bohemia settled there to work in the mines, were brought over to work in the mines, and that's how that county road got its name, because of that. But the Hungarians, yes, there was a lot of them in the Drake's area, and also a number of Hungarians in the Congo mining area, a little town of Congo. But they had a certain style of building their houses. They were somewhat different, and you can see that architecture still down in the Drake's area on some of the homes that are still there. The Hungarian house architecture. It's
So the
yeah.
kitchen was on the first floor, right? And the garden was in the front yard outside of the kitchen. So you could get to your vegetables and herbs and stuff. And then the living room was upstairs, and there was like an overhanging porch on the second floor, and that's where your front porch was. There's a real great example on what we call Green Valley Bottom on Route 155 between Corning. Before you get to Drake's, there's a straight stretch there, and right on the right before you go around the big corner into Drake's, there's a well-kept perfect example of that the Titko family I think lives there.
It's been redone, and it's a absolutely perfect example of it. Yeah, sits there up on the hill there on a township road there. Yeah,
lots of bright flowers. I also remember that the Hungarian women would have in their front yard, and their clothes always had much more bright colors than other folks, to the point that if we wore something that was loud or kind of out there when I was growing up, my dad would say, "You look like a honky." Again, back to that term, but
That's right.
you know, don't wear that, you look like a honky. So that was just the way it was when we were growing up. So yeah.
But they also were immaculately clean people.
Yeah.
I mean, they got carried away with it. You'd see them out there. Even when I was a kid, you know, I'm not a kid now, but in the middle of winter, you'd see them sweeping their front porch.
Yeah. Yeah.
I may be 40 below, they'd be sweeping their front porch. It was just.
And I remember Jean Dudash, who's a lady I remember from Drake's, and a lot of the women, they wore bright red lipstick and big earrings, and they were always very, very colorful in their dress. So yeah. Millie Parsons, who grew up there, she was at Toth, and they ran the saloon in Drake's, also told me this great story about the Hungarian School. And I said, Hungarian School? And she said, yeah, in the summer, we went to Hungarian School. And it was in the church basement there, which I grew up, they called it the Hunky Church, or the Hungarian Church, which is on that row of houses. If you turn right off of 155 coming from Corning when you come into Drake's. And she said, we would go and learn, have lessons about Hungary and speak the language in the church in the summertime. You went to public school during the year, but then you went to Hungarian school in the church in the summertime. And the people of the town just, I don't know exactly what they taught them or anything, but whether it was cultural stuff about Hungary or what it was, but that's what she called it. So, which was really fascinating to me. And the saloon where her family, where she grew up and where her family lived, is that 2-story, they call it the Drake's Hotel a lot of times now, because it had a hotel upstairs. It had, when we were in there in the 80s or 70s or 80s, there used to be this big canvas on the wall behind the bar in there. And there were advertisements like for Parks Drugstore and all these businesses around the area, but it was written they were written in the Hungarian language. So, they probably carried their culture more to the region than anybody else. The Germans started out sharing their culture that way, but then they hid it after World War I and World War II, because it became something they had to hide. You had to hide. I grew up, my family wouldn't talk much about being German, because they basically left Renville because they were, in part, were getting away from the Ku Klux Klan's dislike for not only Black people, but German Catholics too. And it had to do with their Catholicism and their nationality. And there was a German singing club and a German picnic grounds in Corning until World War I, and they all had to shut down and go underground to blend in. And Jim Ing also told me that these are all my favorite stories, so I'll try to get them out and be quiet. But told me about that when his dad, Herman Ing, went to fight in World War I, that his mother told him, "You shoot up in the air. Those people are your people. Don't you dare shoot." So there was definitely, there had to be those sentiments. Imagine you just come from Germany to America, and then you have to go fight your people in a war. So those tensions were real. So
yeah. Also, the Hungarians that came over, you got to remember Hungary, the Mongols conquered Hungary way back when they swept from China, the Mongols, and they swept clear across to Hungary and basically killed a lot of men and raped a lot of women and so forth. And there was a lot of Mongol lineages in a number of the people that came from Hungary over here. and you could see it in their eyes. If you looked in your eyes, you could see it.
Huh,
See the Oriental eyes,
yeah,
and
Huh.
that's
yeah,
some of the reason that some of them came here from Hungary is because there were certain amount of discrimination against them
Mhm.
there because of their eyes.
Wow,
And
I never heard that.
yeah, and
Mm.
but you look at them, and even some of them now, a lot of them that had that have passed away. You know, and the next 2 or 3 generations from them, it's all been kind of muted out.
Right.
It's interesting, the more you look at history and geography, and the more you look at the movements of people, how arbitrary a lot of these prejudices really, you start to see just how silly it is, because it just constantly shifts. Whatever quality, whatever people these prejudices are going to arise against, it's just like a constant moving target depending on the politics of the time.
Yeah.
There's a
And,
good segue here to one of the other questions that we got. In terms of, we're talking about prejudice, but also looking at how people have fought prejudice historically. Now, Anne, I believe you might have got this question in person at your talk the other evening. But one of the questions we did receive tonight is, what evidence have we found of people aiding with the Underground Railroad in this region?
Evidence?
Yep.
Well, there's not been much archaeology done on the sites, which would be pretty good concrete evidence. But most of the evidence, like for Payne's Crossing, let's say, is kind of circumstantial. I mean, when I had all those students for many years, and we did all the research for years on that site, it was not 100% concrete clear that it was an Underground Railroad site. But see, you may not always see that, because it was so secretive that people didn't write a lot of stuff down. There are instances in other areas of the state where they did keep records, but in general, it's pretty sparse. And it really, I mean, we've collected a lot of data, but it was a challenge because of that. And it really took what I call a cultural perspective from the Friends of Freedom Society and the African American researchers that I met through that, to be able to tell us what we were interpreting, what something meant in a census record. So, I mean, evidence, I guess, would be some of the archival things that we saw with the census records, the marriage records, and things like that. But it's the interpretation of those records that we had to learn. There is some archaeology that has been done in Illinois on an identical site that have identified some artifacts within the house areas as Underground Railroad period artifacts. So, I mean, it is done. It's just that we never got to that point because there just aren't sites within Payne's Crossing, for example, that lend themselves to good, solid archaeology. They've been compromised by one thing or another.
Tell people about where Payne's Crossing is for those who don't know. There's some folks here, I don't know if they would know what you're talking about. So.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Payne Cemetery is the only evidence left of Payne's Crossing, and it is right on Route 595, 2 miles south of New Straitsville, right at the Hocking-Perry County line. And I mean, you can never take a pencil to a map and draw a ring around where Payne's Crossing really was. You can't do that to any of these rural farming communities that were Underground Railroad communities. It was done that way on purpose. It was a broad area, geographic area, like I said the other night. But the cemetery is the thing that we worked on most, the physical evidence most, because it's the only thing left. We surveyed the whole tract around it. I mean, a lot of the acreage around it to look for sites like that. We did have one house site, but like I said, people lived on it up until the 70s or 80s, 1970s or 1980s. And when you've got those so-called modern components on top of the early, 1800s components, sometimes you don't have an intact earlier component to look at. These sites in Illinois, they're lucky that on the Shawnee National Forest in Illinois, because they've got sites that are totally Underground Railroad period. So they're like pristine Underground Railroad house sites. And so we always look to them to give us indicators of what we should be expecting out in the field. But for us here, it's the archival stuff would be the evidence.
What's an example of some of the archival material that you've looked at?
Well, the most fascinating one to me was there was a census record where, and for those of you who know census records, they list the head of the household first, which is the man, and then underneath the man would be the wife, and they had the ages, so you could kind of figure out who was, and then the children were all under them. This one record showed a man, and they had race on the census records. The man was listed as, I forget, black or C for colored back then. And the children, I think, were mixed. And then down at the bottom, at the very bottom, there was a woman who was similar to age, if not the same age as the man, but she was down at the bottom, and the guy was white. Sorry. The guy was white and she was black, but she was listed down below. And we're like, what the heck? So we had to take the record to Bev Gray over in Chillicothe, who's one of the best African-American researchers I know with Friends of Freedom Society. And she said, what we have there is probably a story of a man. And they had, and the census record also tells you where they'd come from. Census record said, I believe, that they came from Virginia. And she said what we had there was a white man who fell in love or, hooked up with a black woman, and they had children, and they were slaves, but in order to free them, he moved them all to Ohio, to Payne's Crossing, to be free. And that's what she told us. But those are the kind of things that, any ordinary set of eyes may not pick up. Janice probably would, but, it just, because you do this, you do that kind of research all the time. But that's the kind of thing that we would find. And sometimes there were census records where there would be whites and blacks living in the same household. And it would be a white household, and there would be a couple black adults that were probably farm workers, let's say, or, they were labor. It said laborer in some of them. So sometimes they live with somebody else. But see, this is what I mean about the Payne's Crossing being an Underground Railroad site. Nobody cared about, race too much within that community, because they all knew each other. They moved together. They were doing the same work. And that's why it's often called America's first civil rights movement. Because everybody was working together. So I hope that answers the question. But it would be records like that we needed help with interpreting, and then that's kind of what they would mean.
It's a really terrific answer. I think that sheds a lot of light on the process of historians too, in trying to uncover the past.
Yeah, it was fascinating work. Fascinating.
Well, it has come to my attention that we are closing in on 7 p.m. here, and I wanted to try to get us out in about an hour. I know, I feel like we could ask you guys questions all night, and we should absolutely have more panels like this in the future. But I do want to put in, while we have a few minutes left, a last call in case anyone here live wants to put in a last question.
I have one. I have one question. And this is based on like rumor that I heard growing up in Athens. Were the furnaces used as like stops on the Underground Railroad because you could see them at night? I don't know if that's just like a rumor that we heard in high school or during school, or if that's true.
What kind of furnaces are you talking about?
The iron furnaces?
Oh yeah,
Because
they
you
were.
could see them at night.
Oh, I don't know about whether that's the reason, but the reason down in like Lawrence and Gowdy County were that all the furnace owners were abolitionists, and they moved the slaves up across, when they came across the river because of that, because they were hiding them in the company towns. I don't know about the visible light thing. That's kind of interesting.
It's worth noting there was a furnace not far from Payne's Crossing as well.
Yeah, there was. There weren't as many up here in this northern area of the Hanging Rock Iron region. Most of them were down kind of in Lawrence and Gowdy County, but there were some up here. There's a few in Hocking County, Lake Hope, and that.
Cool. Thank you. Been wondering about that for 20 years.
Yeah, but I don't know about the visible light thing. That's the first time I've ever heard that.
That should be our pitch next time. What have you been wondering about for 20 years?
Yeah.
Come ask our historian.
Fact or history. Fact, fiction, or history.
Yeah.
Well, I am going to close us out here this evening. Thank you all so much. And not just for this evening, but also just for the work that you have done, the research you have done, and everything you continue to do to make sure that these stories aren't lost. It's extremely important to this region. And as someone who lives in this region, I really appreciate it. I would like to put a few shout outs in here at the end for anyone here or anyone who watches this recording later on YouTube. You can always ask our historians questions. We actually, on our website, lcbdohio.org, there is a form you can complete for Ask a Historian. That form will send an email to our organization, and our historians work really hard to make sure that you do get answers. Another avenue where we get questions a lot is through our Facebook. We have a pretty active Facebook presence. Thank you, Tyler McDaniel, for maintaining that. And as far as I have seen in my entire time with this organization, we have never missed a Facebook question and neglected to find some kind of answer. So please feel free to reach out to us there with any questions that you have. Another plug I'll put in here at the end is we have 2 more events as part of our Little Cities Fest from whence we came this year. So tomorrow, it is not a live event, but you can go on our YouTube channel and you can watch a documentary, a really astounding documentary that was made by a woman who currently lives in Great Britain, but whose family came through this region as part of her ancestry. And she's done a fantastic job of documenting that. And then on Saturday, Nikki at noon, is that correct?
Yes, at noon on Saturday, I'm having a story swap, which is essentially where you can come, everybody gets, 10 or so minutes to speak their piece. You don't have to bring photos or anything if you don't want to, but if you want to, awesome. Just about your family's history in the region. I'm looking at everybody on here, including all of the people from little cities that I know have a long family history. I would love to see you here and have you tell your stories to us so we can get them recorded and taken down. But yeah, that's at 12 o'clock. And if we were here in real time, I promise there would be snacks, but there are no snacks on Zoom, and I'm sorry. But that's, 12 o'clock.
In the future.
In the
Someday.
future. Or
we'll
not
have
tomorrow,
events
Saturday.
in person with snacks.
I'm still on COVID time. I can't remember what day of the week it is.
I like that
Tyler
name.
would like to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I like that name, Nikki at noon. That could be a show.
Yeah, there you go.
Lock it down. Tyler would like to remind everybody we also have an Instagram account at the Little Cities of Black Diamonds on Instagram. Thank you everyone commenting in the chat right now. We're really glad that you enjoyed this. And we hope we can see you at the event on Saturday, and we hope that you've really enjoyed this fest. Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.
All you guys have
Bye.
put together. You've done a marvelous job.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.